Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Pullman Police Advisory Committee. I am Stephanie Rink, the chair. Welcome. I would like to first call roll for attendance. Please, starting with Isabella.
Okay, so my name is Isabella Macon. I'm the Pullman High School representative, number 1, I guess.
David Macon, multicultural representative.
Rocky Lucas, faculty representative for Washington State University.
Phyllis Stahlkopf, Sunnyside Hill representative.
Gwendolyn Rink, I am another Pullman High School representative.
I'm Melissa Medali. I'm representing Pioneer Hill.
Eric Tetzloff, business representative.
Adam Williams, Sunnyside Hill representative.
Nathan Dean, Pullman School District parent.
Barbara Hammond, College Hill representative.
Fatima, ASWCU representative.
Megan Parks, WSU GPSA.
Gary Jenkins, Pullman Police Chief.
Darby Baldwin, Chief's Administrative Assistant.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for all of you being here today. So next up will be the approval of the minutes from the October 11th meeting. Do we have any questions, comments, concerns, edits? Microphone, please.
Last time I was about 5 minutes late. I just noticed I'm not in there. Does that mean I don't get included? Roll call. Last.
Oh, the last meeting you were not marked in there. That's right, you were. So we will correct that in the minutes.
Okay.
Yes. He was present last meeting. Any other edits, comments, concerns? All right, seeing none, do we have a motion to pass with the edit of the last minutes?
I'll second.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Wonderful. All right, next up, we have a wonderful guest tonight. Please welcome Officer Kayla Nexell. Yes, and you may remove your mask when you're speaking if you like.
Hello, I'm Kayla Nexell. I've been a police officer here for a little over 2.5 years. I graduated down in Clarkston from the high school down there, and that's where I grew up. I currently live in Lewiston, so I commute every day. It's kind of nice to, be away from work when I'm not at work. It's a nice distance, but it's still not close enough to be able to work up here. I wanted to be a police officer. I grew up, my dad actually built police cars as long as I can remember. As I was a little kid, he was always building them in the shop for different agencies around the valley. So I got to be around a lot of different officers throughout the years. The big switch for me was I was 19 and my neighbor actually overdosed on heroin, and I went over to help because I didn't know what was going on, and ended up doing CPR on him. He ended up dying, but it was a big switch. It made me feel like I needed to, step up and do this job so that someone else didn't have to do what I had to do, because it was pretty scary at the time, not knowing what I was doing or what to expect. But I love it up here. Pullman's a great community, and I really like working up here for everybody. Some of my big hobbies, I'm really, really big into horses. I have my own horse. I ride 3 or 4 times a week. I just got a really young horse, so it takes a lot of time and commitment so that I don't screw her up, and just to, to get her to horse showing level. I do Western pleasure, so I go, in the summers, I go to up to 12 horse shows around the area. It's been something I've been doing since I was I think I was like 8 or 9 is when I started doing horse stuff. So that's a lot of fun. I just got married a couple weeks ago, so.
Congratulations.
Yeah, it's been great, and we have a house, and we've been remodeling it for the past 3 years, trying to get it ready to sell. We want to buy a big property somewhere around Kendrick or Troy, so that we can have a property and not have our neighbors so close to us. But I don't know, I like Pullman a lot, and I'm glad you guys invited me to come out tonight and talk. You guys have any questions for me?
Hi, Craig Watt here. Do you have any experience as an officer down in the valley, or is Pullman your first location?
Pullman's my first location.
Okay.
So I did my internship through college down at the Asotin County Sheriff's Office. So I did 120 hours there, just volunteering and hanging out with everybody.
I'm a former deputy prosecutor for Asotin County,
Okay.
so I was curious what your perspective might be on the differences between Asotin County
It's a
and
little
here.
bit, it's definitely harsher down there. We are definitely more able to work with people up here. It seems like we're more friendly towards the community, and, you know, we tend to work with people that have, you know, chosen to break the law versus hammering them all the time.
So what is your best moment of being an officer here?
Oh, gosh. I have a lot of good times here. Most of the time is when kids are involved. A lot of the times they tend to not be the greatest because it's mostly domestic violence situations that we go to that we deal with kids. But I have this little box I bring with me every day to work full of toys, and every time we go to domestic violence calls, I bring it in and, you know, play with the kids. And so it's fun to, you know, get to see the kids come out of their shell, especially when they've been having a bad day, and be able to, you know, possibly cheer them up a little bit after their parents, you know, might have gone to jail or whatnot. So
Any other questions? for Officer
One more. Oh, sorry. I was going to ask how COVID may have impacted things for you as an officer.
it affected a lot. I started a few weeks before the shutdowns began, and so it affected my field training a lot. We weren't allowed to be proactive like we, you know, like I wanted to be, but it slowly started to get, you know, busier all the time. But it affected my ability, I think, to improve and grow faster because we weren't supposed to go out and do much.
Isabella?
In all the time you've been a police officer or been training, what really stuck out about Pullman that you were like, oh wait, I want to stay here and do good things? I don't know.
Yeah, I think a lot of my coworkers have been, you know, I've, you know, got a relationship with everybody here, and we all seem to see eye to eye on a lot of things, and we get along very well. So, you know, when one person's having a bad day, the other one, you know, cheers you up enough to keep you around, and it's been great having all the people and the relationships I've built up here to keep me here.
What would you say is one of the biggest challenges for your job?
I would say probably the ever-changing, like, laws and procedures that we have to keep up on. It seems like once you finally understand one thing, it changes, and then you have to learn a completely new set of rules and how to function as an officer. So it is hard as, you know, a new officer barely getting your feet wet to switch to the new rules that have just changed.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's wonderful meeting you tonight.
Yeah, it was good to see y'all.
All right, next up, we are going to have a presentation by Chief Jenkins on the department overview.
Stephanie and I were talking the other day just about the Police Advisory Committee, and we wanted to kind of have a little bit of a plan about working with the citizens or the Police Advisory Committee. And one of the things I realized was that I've never presented just kind of a police department overview of how the police department's put together and just an overview of what goes on. So this is an attempt to kind of start that. I'll hit on a few areas, and please ask questions as we go, but hopefully this will give you somewhat of an overview. And then, you know, we also talked about some other areas that we want to involve the Police Advisory Committee, and we'll talk about those some other time as well. But I just, you know, a lot of what I want to do is inform the Police Advisory Committee about how the police department operates and how we address issues and how we see things, because you are really our first line of liaison with our community, and that's the purpose of the committee. So it's important that you understand those things. So with that, I'll start with our organizational chart. So this shows how we would be staffed at fully staffed. So it says 33 commissioned. That means 33 sworn officers. We currently have 29. We have 4 vacancies. We do have 2 people that we will be hiring as soon as there's a spot in the police academy, which is not until April. So that will bring us to 31, and then we are working on a recruitment to hire the last 2 vacancies. Recently, the City Council approved a new position, which is Administrative Sergeant. So that's that position on the far right. That position is not yet filled. That was just approved, and we're working on a promotional process to promote another sergeant to fill, so that we can fill that position. So underneath the Administrative Sergeant is School Resource Officer. So that position currently is in detectives. And so during the non-school year, they assist detectives with their cases and some other duties. But it's really more of a support role, and so that's why that position is going to be moved to Administrative Sergeant. And then we have a Property and Evidence Specialist. That is a support position currently under Support Services, which is where most of our records personnel work. But again, it's a support function, but isn't really fit with records. So that position will be moved under Administrative Sergeant. And then the Police Technology Specialist currently is directly under me, primarily because he does a lot of work all throughout the department, and he does a lot of things for me. But this is really a support role as well. And so that position will be moved under the Administrative Sergeant. We hope to have that position filled. Well, the timing of it is a little up in the air right now. We will probably have the promotional process done before the end of the year, but we may hold off on doing a promotion and creating that position until we get more staffing, because right now, if we promote an officer to sergeant and fill that position, we'll lose a patrol spot. And we're a little bit short on patrol spots right now, so we're going to work a little bit more on the timing of that. So then next to Administrative Sergeant, you see the Support Services Manager. That's Penny Revis, and she oversees all of our record specialists. And our record specialist staff, they're positioned 24/7. So we have a record specialist working every hour of the day. And a lot of the things that they do are really behind the scenes. They transcribe police reports. So when most of their police reports, unless it's very short, they dictate them, and then the record specialist transcribes them. They handle all of the administrative duties that the police department does, such as dog licensing and concealed pistol licensing. Universities are governed by what's called the Clery Act, which has a lot of requirements for them for safety. And it primarily regulates what happens on campus and the area immediately around campus, but also regulates areas where students and faculty go to on university business. So when people from other universities come to Pullman on business, they have to submit records requests for any type of crimes that fit the Clery Act criteria that might have occurred while they were here. And then our record specialists also respond to all the public records requests that we receive. And I'm trying to think of the average that we get a week. I would say it's probably somewhere between 30 and 60. It really varies from week to week, but some of them are fairly routine, like traffic accident reports for insurance companies or for parties involved in traffic accidents, or crime reports that people are involved in. We also provide information to defense attorneys and the prosecution for criminal cases. So there's, and the laws in Washington on public records are fairly complex. I compare it to when I worked in California. They had a few simple rules to follow in California. In Washington, it's a lot more complex. There's a lot to know to be involved in releasing public records on what you have to redact, what you cannot redact, for what reason, and depending on who you're releasing it to and the type of case you're releasing it about. So a lot of agencies train one person to be what they call their public records officer. And typically they'll get certified by a state organization called Washington Association of Public Records Officers. What we decided to do in Pullman was to train all of our record specialists to become public records officers. And so I think 3 or 4 of them right now are fully trained and certified, and the rest of them are well on their way. So that way we can divide the work up amongst them for all the public records requests. Because we saw over the past 6-7 years that there was quite an increase in public records requests, and the work to be done is also increased because of some of the complexity in our job, including body-worn cameras and in-car cameras. So with that type of evidence and someone makes a public records request for it, it's just not a matter of identifying which item of evidence it is or what video it is. They also have to review every minute of those videos to determine if something has to be redacted. And then they have to redact it. And again, it depends on the type of case it is and who they're releasing it to. So there's a lot of work involved in those cases. So we're getting all of our records people trained on that. They answer the business phone at the police department. And so we depend a lot on them, and there's a lot to their job. So over under operations is all of patrol, detectives, and code enforcement. So operations commander is Jake Opgennorth. And so he oversees that division. So you'll see over on the right of operations, code enforcement, we have Senior Code Enforcement Officer Liz Oj, who supervises 3 other code enforcement officers. She's also a working code enforcement officer. And so they handle, we have one that is assigned primarily for downtown parking enforcement. And then the rest of them will respond to complaints and also do some proactive parking enforcement throughout the city. And they handle essentially city code violations, leash law violations involving animals, trash in yards. Usually they'll go out on Saturday and Sunday mornings up in the College Hill area where there might have been parties the night before, and contact the people in charge of the property where there's been trash left out, and we try to keep those areas clean since that's a nuisance violation. Another nuisance that we've gotten a lot of requests for was trash cans that are being left out all week long or blocking sidewalks. And so there's a lot of different parts of their jobs they're involved in. They'll go up and pick up dead domestic and wild animals that have been hit by a car or otherwise killed. They'll respond to a wild animal call if there's a safety concern. So they're involved in a lot of different things. And then we have detectives on the far left there. Detective Sergeant Greg Umbright oversees detectives right now. There is one of the detective positions you'll see is called Regional Drug Task Force. That's a task force made up of Pullman PD, WSU PD, Moscow PD, Lewiston, Clarkston, and Whitman County Sheriffs, Latah County Sheriffs, Soton County Sheriffs. Some of them have a full-time detective assigned to the task force, and they work task force more on a regional basis for drug traffickers that bring drugs to the region. Currently, we do not have somebody assigned full-time there because of our staffing issues. Our patrol coverage takes priority. and there's some other agencies that are in that same position. However, we're still part of the task force, and we still communicate with them. If we have any intelligence or issues that we have with regards to drugs that come to our area, we can pass that information along to them, and they can look at those cases and potentially work those. And then our other detectives are trained to handle cases that require more training than a patrol officer might give usually. So a lot of sex assault offenses, complicated cases like a homicide or a serious assault. Typically it's the cases that a patrol officer just doesn't have the time to be able to manage responding to patrol calls as well and working shift work. So detectives have a lot more flexibility and ability to work with witnesses and victims and the crime lab, and to conduct a more thorough follow-up on cases, and then also with additional training for different types of crimes. And then we have our patrol, which we have 3 different patrol shifts: day shift, swing shift, and graveyard shifts. Each shift has a patrol sergeant assigned to supervise the officers on those shifts. And of course, we have 24/7 coverage in patrol. So even though, for example, day shift, it shows a sergeant and 7 officers, that doesn't mean we have 8 people working every day. You have to account for their days off, training, illness, and all of those things. So typically we may have 3 or 4 people working on a particular shift when you take into account all those factors, and vacation. And then we have one of the officers is assigned primarily to College Hill, and their job really is to develop relationships with students and student organizations, and also residents in the College Hill area, to try to prevent bad things from happening, and to be a resource for them. This position was developed shortly after there were riots here in 98, 99? And what they discovered was that those may have been preventable had the police department had a better relationship with students and student organizations and student leaders. So we've come a long way in that. At one point, I think we had 3 or 4 College Hill officers as secondary duties, and now we really have 1 full-time College Hill officer, and we find that meets our need for now. And then we have reserve officers who are volunteers. They don't get paid. They go through a reserve police academy, and then after training, they're certified with the same powers as a police officer. And after they have, initially there'll be a second officer and ride with another police officer, but once they have enough training and experience, then they can go out and work on their own. Currently, we just have 1 reserve officer, and that is Jeff Gordon, who is police officer Alex Gordon's father. Jeff is a retired IRS investigator, and he was in a sworn officer capacity then, and so he retired, and then I think he decided he didn't want to really fully retire, and so he comes out and he volunteers probably, I'd say 3 shifts a week maybe, which is a lot of volunteer hours. We had Dennis Pratt work for us for about 10 years as a reserve officer, and he donated thousands of hours a year as a reserve officer. So they provide a valuable service to the community. And Administrative Assistant Darby Baldwin, who is the one who actually runs the police department and makes me look good. But she does a lot of like our purchasing, processes all the paperwork for all of the equipment and operational things that we need to purchase, and all the personnel forms that are required when someone is hired or they get a step change in their pay, and processes noise variance applications and street use permits, and So anyway, she's like my right-hand person. So any questions on the organizational chart?
I just had a question, not on the chart necessarily, but
Yeah.
I know some departments with their detectives, they'll just cycle patrol officers in and out of the detectives unit. Wondered what your practice was here in Pullman, and I guess my comment on that is I always think that detective work is, they, like you said, they handle a lot of important cases. It's interesting to me that people cycle in and out of that position.
So like rotation, is that kind of your question? So some departments, when someone gets assigned to detectives, it's an assignment that they stay in until they get promoted out of it or decide they want to change to another position. And in our department, we have a rotation system set up where someone will be assigned to detectives for an initial 3-year period, and then they can extend year by year up into 6 years, I think is the maximum. So there's pros and cons to operating either way. With a department our size, the lateral opportunities are very limited. We do have a number of assignments that officers can do in addition to being a patrol officer that they don't do full-time, but they, like trainers, our trainers are all do something else full-time, but like our firearms instructor will train firearms and as a additional duty. But for full-time opportunities are very limited, and so the pro of putting someone into a detective position and leaving them for a long time is they become very well trained, they become very experienced, and they become outstanding investigators. The con is that takes away a spot that other people could also occupy and maybe not be available for them for 10 years. And so actually when I came to Pullman, the detective position was an assignment and people would just stay there. And the experience that I had with the agency I worked in California, it was a similarly sized agency that we had rotations, and I saw the advantages to having the opportunity for people to come in and out of that position, and also when they come out of that position and go back to patrol, what they can pass along to patrol officers based on their training experience they received in detectives. So, there's definitely an up and down side to both ways. It was just my belief that having the rotation in an agency our size provides more opportunity and does help staff grow. More of our staff can grow rather than just a select few. Excuse me. So one of the ways that we try to figure out whether we are adequately staffed is looking at our per capita officers that we have on staff. So this is a comparison of law enforcement agencies in Washington State that serve populations between 25 and 50,000, with the exception of course, Moscow PD in Idaho. And I just list them on there because they're so close to us. And so you can see that our per capita right now, of course, we have 29. We're authorized 33, and so that's in the blue there if we were at full staff. My goal has I always felt that the types of crimes that we deal with on a regular basis and our call volume, if we can maintain a 1.05 ratio, then I think we'd be doing well. And so that's kind of the target that I've tried to aim for since I've been here. When I started, we had 28 sworn officers, and so we've increased that by 5 since the time I've been here. So you can see, for example, Moscow PD has 1.42 officers per thousand, which is quite a bit more than we have. And one of the things that to think about, and I always think about this when there's some articles in the paper about some things that agencies are doing in the community and different programs that they're operating. Moscow does a lot of programs, and they do a lot of things out in the community. And one of the reasons they're able to do that is because of their per capita ratio that they have. They're fairly, close to our community. They don't have the university isn't quite as large. They don't have a Division I sport, so we have that additional activity in our area. But other than that, I think we're pretty comparable. So, and then if you look at the other ones on there, there's quite a range. Of course, some of those departments deal with a lot of different crime picture than we do in Pullman, and so that's, I think, a lot more justified to have that higher per capita ratio. I was going to look and see what, for example, New York PD, I think, has probably the highest in the U.S. They may have like 10 officers per 1,000. I mean, that's huge. They have a huge police department. LAPD probably is closer to 2 or 3. And of course, again, they have different crimes that they deal with, and a much more complicated organization to run. Yeah.
How does the University Police Department figure into these numbers, since the population appears to include the university students?
Yeah, so the population does include the students. So about 75% of the students live off campus. So they're included in the population. Of course, as you know, the university does have their own police department who respond to law enforcement issues on campus at the dorms and offices and buildings. But they are counted in our population primarily because we probably deal with, a lot of the students, even the ones that live on campus. And Moscow's numbers, I never have gotten a clear indication about how they come up with their population number, whether that includes University of Idaho students or not, because I know different communities look at that differently. And then our crime stats do not include Washington State University crimes that occur on campus. So this one's a little bit complicated. It takes a couple minutes to look at. So I'm using 2001 as a baseline for if our staffing and call volume and everything was ideal right then. That's essentially what it's based on, which is arguable. I just had to pick a baseline somewhere. So I'm starting with 2001. And so the blue line is population, and you can see that that's been a continual increase over the years from 2001 to, this goes up to 2019. The green line is calls for service. That was kind of up and down up until about 2013. Then we had a huge jump, and then it's kind of come back down a little bit. So we're going to have to see how that continues on, whether it's going to continue to decline or not. Typically, you would see over at least a long period of time those calls for service more closely parallel the population. That's a lot of what will drive your calls for service. So there's 3 lines that all overlap along the bottom of the number of officers that we have. Because so we had 28 officers up until, well, it's been a while since I've looked at this. So in 2015, see what's happening. Okay, well, so the yellow one you can see is 29 officers. So those lines, the 29, 33, and 35 officers, which are the 33, of course, we were approved by council, but we've never gotten there. That's how that would look in comparison with, those are just meant to show somewhat of a comparison with population and calls for service. And then if we were at 35 officers, is that higher line that is closer to where the population is going and intersects the calls for service. So of course the scales aren't equal. Again, I just started with a baseline and tried to figure out some way to show what the correlation is between our staffing and then calls for service and population, which are really our drivers for what we need as far as staffing goes, as well as the types of calls that we go on. So for example, there's calls that we will respond to that large organizations might not even respond to. So that won't even show up on their calls for service chart because they just don't go to them. So this is based on what our community has expects from us as far as responding to calls. I think we did go over this at one point. Some of the newer members might not have seen this before, but a few years ago we worked with a University of Washington, had a master's program that offered to have students working on their master's degree to work with organizations on different projects, and we submitted a proposal to develop a strategic plan. And so we were accepted to participate, and we were assigned 3 students, and their master's program was to work with us to develop a strategic plan. And they kind of failed at that because what we ended up with was a strategic vision, which in my mind is way better than a specific strategic plan. So we ended up getting, I think, more than what we really asked for to start with. And they met with people in our department, people in the city. Whoops, didn't want to do that. People in the community, and interviewed a really big cross-section of our community to find out what they wanted in their police department, what they expected in their police department, where there were gaps of what we were providing and what they wanted. And as a result, what we found was that instead of coming up with a plan, it was more of a vision of what the community wants for the police department, the community and the people inside the police department and city leaders. And so we came up with this strategic vision. And there were different goals that were developed, and I'm not going to go through all of these line by line, but this is one of the overarching goals, is that we have an exceptional work culture. And so we have high expectations for our staff, but we provide our staff the resources to achieve those expectations. And teamwork, holding people accountable. And this was all, our staff had a lot of input on this, and so they all have buy-in on these goals, which means they want us to hold them accountable because they understand that that is what you have to do when you have high standards. And then our relationship with our community is very important. And this is something, and all of the things on here aren't necessarily things that the community said, oh, this isn't happening, I want this to happen. A lot of this is the community said, we really value this, and let's make sure that we maintain this. And then some of them are areas of gaps that we need to work toward. Again, this goes to the resources and making sure that they have what they need to be able to function at a high level. Anticipate and address challenges that we plan for the future. That we're in a position that we can mitigate impacts of any type of trends that might affect the safety in the community. And then being innovative. And, you know, this is really a something that requires a culture change, because when you hold people accountable, depending on how you do that, sometimes people are less willing to take chances because they don't want to make a, quote, mistake or do something wrong. And so being innovative means taking chances, taking calculated risks. You know, it doesn't mean being foolish and throwing all caution to the wind, but there is some chance involved in this, and some risk and the potential failure. And so the people in our organization know that if they take these calculated risks, that they might fail, but they won't be penalized for failing, that they are fulfilling this goal by taking a risk to be innovative. And that's the only way an organization can really grow, is to have innovation. And so I think this is one culture change I think that we've seen over the past few years at Pullman PD. And I think it's one reason why we are usually at least on par with recent trends of things that are happening in law enforcement and best practices. This is just kind of an overview. This is some stuff that was in the annual report that you all got a copy of. And this is kind of an overview of, you know, kind of what makes up our work and our calls. You know, you heard from Kayla tonight talking about domestic violence calls. We do have a lot of those, and a lot of our calls are disturbance or disorderly related. It's amazing how many animal-related calls we have. We have a lot. Airport security, I may have explained this to you all before, but FAA requires a law enforcement presence at all outgoing flights, commercial flights. And of course, the larger police departments have their own, or larger airports have their own police departments, and Pullman Regional does not have their own police department. So Pullman PD provides that law enforcement presence for outgoing flights. I said FAA requires it for all outgoing flights. That's not exactly true. We have about a 70 to 80% coverage rate, and FAA is fine with that. But as we add more flights to the airport, it's going to require more of a presence of our staff. And I think ultimately we'll probably have a full-time person there to fulfill the requirements of the FAA. FAA does have a reimbursement program where they will reimburse us for time spent at the airport. The problem with that is there are strings attached to that, meaning that if we do accept that money, then for every outgoing flight, an officer has to be there so much time before the flight leaves and so much time after the flight leaves. Would tie up an officer for about 3 hours for each outgoing flight. And we would essentially, the money that they would reimburse us, we would end up losing money if we took that money, at least at the present time. So we'll revisit that as there are more flights added, and we're going to have somebody there full-time anyway.
Does the airport pay for anything?
No. I guess it's considered part of the City of Pullman's contribution. And in fact, I added it to our annual report starting 3 or 4 years ago because I think it was just nothing that was ever talked about, and that exact question was becoming more and more of a question in my mind about how that's going to be resolved in the future. I think there's going to be a question about that, particularly as it's going to take more and more of our staff's time, because it's quite a commitment and contribution.
Are you the only agency that does it?
We're the only agency. So since they're in the city limits, it's ours. Moscow PD across the state line would be fairly complicated type of a thing, and so yeah, we're the ones that do it. Gives you an idea of our arrests. So criminal citation is a situation where we could physically take someone into custody for an arrest and bring them to the police station and book them, but instead we issue them essentially an infraction and release them in the field instead of bringing them in for booking. So they're technically arrests. And then parking infractions. So I may have talked about this when we talked about the annual report, but it used to be all crime stats were under what was called Uniform Crime Reports, or UCR. That is now all changed as of this last year. All agencies are required to report with National Incident-Based Reporting System, which is collects data differently than UCR. UCR used a hierarchy approach where if there was an incident that involved a number of different crimes, only the most serious crime would be counted. Under NIBR's, National Incident-Based Reporting System, all crimes are counted. So it's a lot more accurate picture of crime that occurs. And so that's now the way that crimes are going to be reported. So they have what are called Group A offenses, and I'll show you more of a detail on that in a second, but they're divided between property, persons, and society crimes. And so these are our Group A offenses since 2009. So you can see, in fact, I should have put the calls for service line on here because I think that closely parallels our crime picture. We had some increases and then a recent trend of a downward trend. And I'll show you what the crimes are here. So these are the property crimes. So the highest volume of crimes that we see are larceny and vandalism. So those two crimes are really what drives a lot of our overall crime picture because those are really the biggest influencers of the volume of crime that we have. And then these are the other two categories and how they're broken up. So, you know, we could have 10 murders in a year and it really wouldn't put a big dent in our overall crime picture. You know, but obviously that many murders in a year is a big deal. But you can see where those property crimes are really the majority of the crime that we see in Pullman. Darby is our social media guru. We started on Facebook probably a couple of years maybe before Darby got here. And then since Darby came, I think our activity on Facebook has increased quite a bit. We've also gotten on Twitter. Our website is updated regularly. We're on Instagram, MyPD app, Nextdoor. In fact, I need to add the new one on here, Ring Neighbors. We issued a news release on that, I think, last month. So anyway, there's a lot of ways that we can connect with our community. And I think everybody gets their information in a different way. It's not from everybody gets it from the newspaper or the radio anymore. It's, I think a lot of it is social media. We still do news releases and provide information to the newspapers and the radio and TV press. But I think on the day-to-day, particularly, I wouldn't even say younger generation, but I think everybody probably is getting their information on some type of digital platform. There's probably more that we could do, but I don't know how close we are to being overextended already. It's a lot to manage. And so we just want to make sure that we're on the platforms that will most likely reach our intended audience. So jurisdiction. So this is a map showing the city boundaries. At least when I put this together, it has probably changed. Actually, since I put this together, there are annexations going all the time. So it's interesting to note, if you see Pullman Regional Airport there on the upper right-hand corner, it's just goes around the airport. And when the airport was built, the city annexed that into the city and just went right around the airport. You'll see that Washington State University is included in the city limits, so it is still within our jurisdiction. However, Washington State University Police Department handles all primary law enforcement duties there. And then outside the city boundaries would be Whitman County Sheriffs. And then also you'll see State Patrol, which I think my next, so yeah, here's the different agencies that you'll see in and around Pullman. So of course, Pullman PD at the top, Washington State University on the left. Now you'll see Washington State University police cars off campus because they, when they investigate crimes, sometimes that takes them off campus to talk to witnesses or to collect evidence and to do whatever. And then you'll see our officers on campus for the same reason, or even just if they're driving through to go to a call. So the bottom one is Whitman County Sheriffs, and so they have law enforcement authority throughout the entire county. So we are to them kind of like WSUPD is to us. We're in their jurisdiction, but we are responsible for primary law enforcement services in the city limits. But you'll see their cars around Pullman and making traffic stops and investigating crimes that occur in the county. And then, of course, State Patrol, primarily traffic enforcement on state highways. So you'll see them on 26 and 270. They also will assist with major traffic collisions if we need it. I'm gonna, this is actually part of another presentation, so, well, I'll go through some of this. So here, kind of what I call high-profile work that our police department is involved in. And I think these are things that if you ask somebody to make a list of what does Pullman Police do, that these would be, you know, fairly simple to think about. That, you know, this is what Pullman Police does. So these are typical enforcement responsibilities and keeping the peace responsibilities. Then the lower profile, some things that maybe you don't think about after you think about those calls, are what's involved in after we go to a call and the follow-up investigation and evidence, submitting to crime lab or preparing evidence to send to the crime lab and working with the crime lab, working with prosecution. A lot of times we'll get cases sent back to us from the prosecuting attorney asking for some additional investigation. Some of these things are some that I mentioned that records is involved with and issuing or handling administrative duties. And of course, processing the crime reports from the officer dictating it and the records specialist typing it up and getting it approved, and then being distributed to the court and the prosecuting attorney and defense attorneys. As you heard Kayla talk about changing laws, and that's just part of law enforcement. You hear the term case law, and that's essentially case decisions that come from courts that have authority to rule on cases that will impact the way that law is interpreted. And those cases happen every day, and some have more impact than others. So those are the types of things that we have to stay on top of and pay attention to. We have to make sure our staff are trained on what we expect them to do. You know, weapons proficiency. You know, since I've been at Pullman, we've never had an officer use their firearm against anyone. So does that mean we should never train with them? You know, based on our use, you would think, well, why do we spend so much training? It's because of the consequences of making a bad decision with the firearm is so great that we have to consistently and constantly train with our firearms to make sure that if and when that time comes, we do make the proper decision. And actually, you know, all the time officers are making decisions about whether to use force and at what level of force to use. And so even though we're not firing our firearm, force issues happen regularly. And so it's something that needs to have training consistently. Crisis intervention, de-escalation. You know, de-escalation is kind of a newer term that's used for something that law enforcement is trained in all the time. Staying up with crime trends, particularly with technology, that makes it really tough to stay up with the latest way that criminals use technology to commit crimes, and to have our people trained and to detect that and collect evidence for that. And of course, all of the things that are involved in running an organization. You know, when Kayla's up here talking, it just makes me proud that she's representative of people that we hire, because she's a high quality police officer, and that's something that we really strive for. And we have vacancies now because we passed applicants by. I mean, we've had applicants we could have hired, but we've chosen not to because they didn't meet our standards. And so we're not going to fill a position just to get a body in that position. We will wait until we find the right person for that position. You know, I did mention this looking at schedules. So our patrol officers currently are working what's called a 4-10. So that means they work 4 days a week, 10 hours a day, each shift. And then a lot of them, we have a lot of vacancies at times because if somebody's at training or calls in sick or is on vacation, we need to fill those empty spots. So officers do work a lot of overtime to fill those, especially when we're down to start with. And our records people also work a 4-10. So there's some overlap both in patrol and in records. And then our detectives work what's called a 980, so they work 9 hours a day, 4 days a week, and then there's an hour there that they have to hit 80 hours in a 2-week period. But so generally they're working. Actually, I take that back. They're working 410 too now, aren't they? Used to work a 980. Yeah. So Commander Opgenorth works like a 980. No, he works a 410 too. I think I'm the only one that's not working on a nice schedule. I'm working on a 7-200, I think, something like that. So anyway, those are really preferred schedules. For a long time, you know, like patrol would work an 8-hour day, 5 days a week, and that's shift work, so they work graveyard. And then try to have 2 days off, and it's really hard to switch your wake and sleep cycle over a 2-day period, then come back and work graveyard again. So it's really hard. It's really hard on their personal lives and their body to do that. So 410 is better. It gives them that extra day off, or an extra day to work overtime, but still have 2 days off after that. So, and then we have all of our policies and procedures. This is the table of the index, right? No, it's the table of contents for the manual that we're working on transitioning to right now. We've already transitioned a few of these policies. We're currently working with the police union or the guild to come to an agreement on the rest of the policies. And so this is what our new policy manual will look like as far as the table of contents. So, you know, there's a lot in there in the policy manual, But we have a lot of requirements that we have for our staff on do's and don'ts. This is really not, this is part of another presentation I was doing. This is kind of what Jake and I spent a lot of time doing in our roles. And we liaison with other organizations. Jake's our daily public information officer, so he talks to the press on a daily basis. And then I will usually talk to the press if it's more of a policy matter or a bigger picture type of a issue that needs my attention. Blah, 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 blah. So hopefully that gave you kind of a big picture overview of the police department and the organization. And maybe we'll help you kind of sort things out in your head as you hear them or have heard them in the past, and kind of where it fits in the organization. Does anybody have any questions?
So I have two. So one, when does the grave shift start? When does it be considered a grave shift?
So the graveyard shift starts at 9 p.m. and ends at 7 a.m. And then swing shift is 4 p.m. to 2 a.m. So swing and graveyard overlap. I'm sorry, they overlap a few hours, and then day shift is 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. And so they overlap a little bit with swing shift. Where there is no overlap is between graveyard and day shift. Graveyard's getting off at 7 a.m. and day shift is coming in at 7 a.m.
And then for my second question, when you were looking at the showing the policies, what is the ride-along policy?
I believe our minimum age is 16. And I don't think we have any. We do like a really limited background check. So if somebody has warrants, we'll ask them to come in and go on the ride along, then we'll arrest them on the warrant. But maybe we let them ride a little bit first. I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
When you were talking about policies and the new manual and everything, and you talked about working with the police guild, could you tell me, like, I assume it's like a union, but what is the scope? Is the scope just for us or for Washington State? And what authority do they have versus autonomy for the local police department?
So the police, it's called a guild in Washington, and they're the union, a labor union. And so the Pullman Police Officers Guild has two groups that they represent. One group is called the uniform group, so that is the sworn officers, with the exception of myself and Commander Up North. We're unrepresented. And then also they have a support group, which are all the everyone else, all the support people. Except for Penny Revis and Darby. So there's four of us that are unrepresented. We're not represented by the guild, mainly because of the roles that we have in the organization. And so one of their primary responsibilities is to bargain their contract with the city. And so it's pay and benefits. In fact, we're going through that right now. Their current contract expires December 31st this year, and we're meeting tomorrow. We've come to a tentative agreement on the uniform contract for the next 3 years, and we're meeting tomorrow to talk about the support contract. So that's primarily what they do. They also are involved in when we do internal investigations and representing their members during those interviews, and advocating for their rights during the discipline process. You know, that was, I think, the biggest learning curve for me coming from California to Washington, because Washington is a collective bargaining state, so law enforcement, there are certain occupations that have what's called, not collective bargaining, that's not the word I want, binding arbitration, meaning that if there's an impasse in negotiations, it can go to an arbitrator, and the arbitrator can make a decision, and the city and the guild both have to abide by that. So that, and they lean more towards employee rights. So that gives the guild a certain amount of power. In California, there was no binding arbitration in law enforcement. And so when I came to Washington, there was a huge learning curve for me, which initially started with, I was probably here less than a month, and filed an unfair labor practice because I was trying to come up with a record schedule that all our records people liked, but I wasn't going about it the right way. So anyway, I had to learn those things along the way. And, you know, and actually, and I have to say in Pullman, our guild president is Scott Patrick, and Scott really has the best interest of the police department and the community in mind. It's not all about what can I get, you know, selfishly. Of course, he wants to do the best he can for the employees, but I think I've come to really appreciate Scott in that role because it could be a lot more adversarial. But I think we found a good common ground that we work on to work together to, you know, try to make the police department a better place.
So I had a statement, and then a question, but since there was a question on per capita, I think it's important to recognize that Washington is last in officers per capita. I mean, we have a very serious issue in Washington State around that. And the question was your operating budget. So, what is that? How has it changed over the years? Do you anticipate that being a problem moving forward? I think that's a point of conversation I see agencies and cities having is around their budget.
Yeah. Yeah, so the police department is what's called a general fund agency, meaning that our funds come from the city's general funds, and for us that means primarily property taxes and sales tax. There's other fees and taxes that are collected, but those are the two primary revenue sources of where our budget is derived, as well as the fire department. There are some places that have, say, fire districts, that they have a separate tax for funding those agencies. We don't have that here in Pullman. It's something that could happen, but we don't have it here right now. So there's a pool of money that's available to all the general fund departments in the city that has to be split up. And so we now work on 2-year budgets. So every time we go through the budget process, it's figuring out how that's split, and who, you know, does the fire department get this percent? Does the police department get this percent? Parks, do they get this? So parks, they get some money in other ways as well for some of their programming. Transit also gets money from different grants and other revenue sources, and University SWSU, I think, contributes towards transit. So some of those departments have different revenue sources. We don't, and so we are dependent upon a limited amount of funds. And so in Washington State, property taxes, I think, are regulated, and they're only allowed to, they increase 1% a year or something like that. Anyway, it's very limited. So when you were looking at that population graph, I think the revenue sources is not even close to that. And so I think one of the real challenges for the future of the city is being able to fund the services that are needed to serve the growing population.
Any other questions for Chief Jenkins? Well, Chief, how about we roll right into the police department update?
All right, let me go over to my notes over here. So you may have seen in the paper that we did some active shooter training for city employees at City Hall. We had done similar training at the old City Hall building, and so it's been a while since we did that, and they were in a new facility, and so how we would want employees to respond to either an active shooter or some type of a confrontation really depends on the specific venue, and so we provided training here at City Hall for employees. I mentioned our vacancies and recruitment. So we have 4 vacancies, and we do have 2 job offers out to 2 applicants who will begin the police academy on April 19th. Last week, we had another round of interviews that we conducted of police officer applicants, and that list just went to the Civil Service Commission this morning, and so now we'll be having chief interviews of the top applicants from that, and then start working on background investigations to hopefully fill the next 2 positions. We have 2 records vacancies. We hired to fill one of those. Kayla Loop is going to begin working with us this Wednesday to fill one of those positions. We did have someone in background for the other position that failed background. So we just had a chief's interview on the next applicant on the list today, and we started a background on her. I may have mentioned this before, but Rick Peringer, who is our property and evidence specialist, is retiring at the end of January. We did an in-house recruitment because we had in-house staff that were interested in that position, and so Josh Sanders, who's currently our public records officer, is now working with Rick and training in that new position to take over. So taking Josh's place as the public records officer is Sally Crandallmeyer. And so she has started that new position now. We were awarded, and I don't think we talked about the Law Enforcement Mental Health and Awareness Grant. Did we talk about that here? That we applied for it? So anyway, well, I'll go over it again just in case. Megan Parks and Dr. Macon and Darby wrote up a grant application for it's called the Law Enforcement Mental Health and Wellness Grant. We're proposing to fund a peer support program amongst Pullman PD, WSU PD, and Moscow PD, and we were awarded the grant. And so we're going to begin work on putting that together, and the idea is to have peer support counselors trained within each organization, and then have a pool of peer support staff who is available to provide assistance to all 3 organizations. And then Dr. Macon and Megan Parks are going to be conducting research on the efficacy of the program as well as the impact to the peer support counselors themselves. Did I describe that correctly? So I do read what you write. There was I think this is a year or 2 old. It was a Senate bill called the Law Enforcement Mental Health and Wellness Task Force, and they were charged with putting together some recommendations on law enforcement officer wellness and suicide prevention because of the increasing issues that we've seen in that area. So one of the positions on that task force is a Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs appointee, and Chief Scott Beerbaum from Issaquah Police Department has been serving in that role. He's leaving law enforcement. I think yesterday may have been his last day. Anyway, WASPIC appointed me to take his place on that task force, so I'll be working with that task force to finalize their report and roll out the recommendations that they have. You may have seen that OSHA issued requirements based on President Biden's mandate to vaccinate employees who work for employers with 100 or more employees. There was just a federal court that issued a stay on that requirement, so we'll have to see how that plays out. But we're expecting now the state, LNI, who's our workers' comp organization, will likely issue guidelines for the state of Washington with respect to the federal mandate. So we are waiting to hear about that. And of course, the city of Pullman would meet the criteria for an impacted organization. Next week is the WASPIC conference, and Commander Opka North and I will be attending that from Monday afternoon to about Thursday midday. Our Citizen Academy will have their 9th session this week, out of 15 total. And I think that's all I have. Anybody have any questions?
All right, well, seeing none, we'll go right to our constituencies poll. Isabella?
There's I guess I have a few updates from the high school, I would say. So we have Veterans Day off this Thursday. It's a weird schedule, so we literally go Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, normal schedule, and then Friday is Thursday's schedule for the PHS. Robin Hood, the drama club's play is happening. It happened, I believe, Friday, Saturday, and then it's happening again this weekend for a Saturday matinee. I'm gonna let Gwen elaborate more on that. And then that's pretty much all I have to say.
Nothing for me?
I can't think of anything for Pullman faculty to update.
And I also have nothing for Sunnyside Hill.
Okay, so I have a couple things. So yeah, Robin Hood opening night was last Thursday. This week we're performing on Thursday night at 7, Friday night at 7, and then Saturday matinee at 2, I believe, and then Saturday night for our closing night at 7. And then also we're about on next Thursday on the 18th. We're having, I think that's the day, we're having our first sort of assembly pep rally since COVID happened. So, and that's out of school, or it's, I think at 5:30, so it's going to be fun to finally see a small sort of assembly. But I think that's all.
Thank you. Nothing to report from Pioneer Hill.
Nothing really to report business. I was curious, the recent incident that hit the news regarding a WC administrator and a council member. There was concern expressed about the how the police officer who looked into that as far as conflict of interest and stuff. And I was curious, policy-wise, what your policy is for a situation like that.
So our social media policy is one that actually we're looking at it in the new Lexipol manual, because the one that we have, we're really relying on the city's policy, which really governs primarily social media use at work, whereas there are implications of social media use off work that can impact someone's performance. So we are actually sent a version of that to the police guild to review, to come to an agreement so we can go ahead and implement that policy ahead of the full policy manual.
At large, nothing to report.
So I am the Pullman School District parent, and besides Thanksgiving coming up in a couple weeks, and schools closed, be mindful of the kids that might be just walking around and doing whatnot that maybe they're not supposed to be doing. That's all.
I have nothing to report for Sunnyside Hill.
I have nothing to report.
No, nothing.
For students, the only concern that's been kind of going around is people are thinking that we won't be going back in person after Thanksgiving break. A lot of students have shown concern that, will the university go back and online for the rest of the semester, but that is not under the administration's radar. That will not be happening unless it's worst case scenario, but I think it's good to kind of assure students that the university is not planning on doing that after Thanksgiving break. So that's all I have.
Nothing to report.
Nothing to report.
Barbara, I think at the last meeting you brought up a stop sign that was missing, and I think we got that resolved, did we?
Yes, the stop sign has been put in, and I have even occasionally noticed people obeying it. So.
Yes?
Okay, I forgot that I was saying one more thing. So at our last ASB meeting, or 2 weeks, I think, passed, some students brought up a concern about safety in the school because during zero period, because the doors are completely unlocked and there's no one watching them. So in a week or so, or whenever the principal and vice principal are not too busy and not concerned about fighting in the school, then I'll be meeting with them as an ASB rep to talk about that.
What time is zero period?
It's a 7:10, but a lot of students get there about 7-ish, to 7:15. But anyone can basically walk in no matter what.
I'll make sure that that's on Scott Patrick's radar as a school resource officer too.
Anything else? Any other? Okay, well, seeing that we don't have any public, so we don't have any public comments. So our next meeting is January 10th, as we did decide to cancel the December meeting. So I hope all of you have a wonderful holiday, whatever you celebrate. Eat lots and lots of food, and be mindful of the snow this year, and be safe. And we'll see you next year.